Rice in Korean culture.
This segment explores the historical role of rice, barley, and wheat in Korea's food supply system, their cultural significance, and the impact of Japanese colonialism on agricultural practices and food consumption patterns. Rice has been the most important cereal crop for Koreans since its introduction to the Korean peninsula. Carbonized rice grains excavated in Sorori, Chungcheongbuk-do, South Korea in 1998 are acknowledged to have been buried in the late Paleolithic era, which makes it the earliest existing sample of rice used as food. With rice being the most important crop, Korean efforts to increase rice yields have continued for thousands of years. In traditional society, timely and sufficient irrigation was the principal determinant of harvest quantities, leading to persistent efforts to improve irrigation systems. New techniques such as transplantation and fertilization method, whether indigenously developed or introduced from China, contributed to increasing yields. Specifically, growing awareness of fertilizers' importance in the late Joseon period led to increased compost usage. This historical change was also reflected in many proverbs, such as a bowl of rice might be given freely, but never a basket of compost. However, fertilizer required moderation. Excessive application would cause plants to appear healthy in summer, but ultimately produce more empty husk than grain. Proverbs like "Don't marry into a family whose rice looks dark in July" warn against excessive fertilization. Until the early 20th century, however, rice was the staple crop for Koreans more in imagination than in reality. Owing to a chronic shortage of rice, common people in pre-modern Korean society could expect a bowl of glossy, thoroughly polished white rice only on family ritual days or national holidays. Nothing illustrates Koreans' desire for rice more strikingly than the North Korean political slogan, "Rice is a socialism," which promised a bowl of white rice and a bowl of meat soup as an outcome of the socialist revolution.
Alternative crops for survival.
As rice shortages were common, Koreans developed various alternative food crops to avoid famine. Barley was the most important alternative or supplements to rice for two reasons. First, barley grains could be boiled together with rice without milling, making it perfectly compatible with Korean food culture centered on rice. Second, Koreans discovered that double cropping of barley and rice formed a reliable combination in many parts of the Korean peninsula. The historical importance of barley is evident in the idiom "barley hump" or "barley hill," which remained familiar to Koreans until the 1970s. This hump referred to the critical period in late spring, when the rice harvested in the previous autumn had run out, but spring barley was not yet ripened. If one managed to survive the barley hump, one could anticipate a bountiful autumn harvest and another year of subsistence until facing another hump next year. Other crops, including various kinds of beans and sorghums, were widely cultivated throughout the peninsula as well. Potatoes and sweet potatoes were introduced to the Korean peninsula in the 17th century and soon became important crops in some areas. Beans, mostly soybeans, were also an important source of protein in an agrarian society where meat was generally scarce. Wheat, on the other hand, did not occupy a substantial part of the everyday diet of pre-modern Koreans. Wheat was cultivated in limited areas within the Korean peninsula, and its production was nominal compared with rice and barley. For Koreans, cooking with wheat was generally considered a different from, rather than complementary to, boiling rice. Unlike rice or barley, wheat could not simply be boiled in grain form, but required extra preparation procedures such as milling and kneading. Additionally, as ovens were not part of traditional Korean kitchens, baking was not common in Korea. Nonetheless, at least one wheat variety originating from the Korean peninsula has left a significant footprint in the global history of agriculture. There were native Korean varieties of wheat, some of which were adopted by Japanese agronomists by the end of the 19th century and improved to become the Japanese semi-dwarf wheat variety, Daruma. Norin No. 10, a modern successor of Daruma, was subsequently adopted by American agronomists as one of the parents for Norman Borlaug's famous semi-dwarf wheat of the late 1950s, which initiated the famous Green Revolution.
Modern nutritional science and rice in Korea.
Under the Japanese colonial rule, there was a subtle but important change in the way rice was perceived and the manner in which the rice shortage was described. The language of modern nutritional science began to imply that it might not be so lamentable to consume less white rice because white rice is not a desirable food for health. The warning against white rice that began in the early 1900s was based on contemporary research on beriberi, or kakge in Japanese and kakki in Korea, a syndrome caused by a deficiency of vitamin B1. Beriberi was first researched by the Dutch in today's Indonesia and reported to the West as an endemic disease in rice-eating Asian countries. After the Meiji Restoration, Japanese doctors trained in Europe began research on the disease, which was also known as the wealthy people's disease in Japan. On the other hand, in early modern and colonial Korea, where rice supply usually fell short of demand, beriberi had never been a nationwide problem. It was noteworthy that a Japanese scientist made a significant but often overlooked contribution to discover the nature and cause of beriberi. In 1910, Suzuki Umetaro, a Japanese chemist, successfully isolated a water-soluble nitrogen-containing substance from rice bran that could cure beriberi in pigeons. He named this substance orizanin and published his findings in a Japanese chemistry journal, describing it as an accessory food factor essential for preventing beriberi. Although this discovery preceded the isolation of the same substance in the West, Suzuki's work remained largely unrecognized in the Western scientific circles, mainly because Suzuki published his findings in Japanese rather than in widely circulated Western scientific journals. Casimir Funk isolated the same substance and named it vitamin and was recognized as its discoverer. Apart from this priority issue, the importance of rice bran in preventing and curing beriberi soon became widely recognized internationally. In other words, the awareness that consuming polished white rice could potentially be harmful to health began to spread. Administrators who had to manage food supply and demand on a national scale found this news unexpectedly useful. The colonial authorities promoted brown rice consumption, even using provocative slogans like "polished white rice is poison." Even after 1945, Koreans were long exposed to the similar propaganda in the name of science.
Colonial rice policy enforced austerity.
During the Japanese colonial period, rice production increased considerably through active government intervention in agriculture, such as the Rice Production Increase Plan. However, within the distorted structure of the colonial economy, even as rice productivity increased, an even greater amount was exported to Japan each year, paradoxically leading to a gradual decrease in rice consumption among Koreans. Following Japan's invasion of China in 1937, the Japanese government implemented severe austerity policies throughout the empire. The colonial government enforced forced collection and rationing to secure rice. Korean farmers had their self-produced rice confiscated through mandatory collection and were forced to survive on imported miscellaneous grains from Manchuria, alternative food such as artificial rice or even soybean oil cake, a substance originally used as a fertilizer. The consumption of white rice was strongly discouraged, and the use of rice for brewing was banned. The state justified its austerity policy in the name of nutritional science. Officially, the reason to encourage the consumption of brown rice or mixed grains was not to save rice for the front line, but to maintain people's health. State-controlled media eagerly published articles warning of the potential harm of white rice, alongside the news that rice saved by schools, corporations, and other groups on the home front was being donated to the front line. This rice was typically conserved through a massive hunshik or mixed grain diet campaign, which effectively functions as an additional tax on the people. One problem with the sustainable of the hunshik campaign was that people were forced to compromise their everyday diet. For Koreans, as for most Asian people, white rice was best suited for boiling or steaming in intact grains. Brown rice was stiffer than fully polished rice and difficult to digest due to its outer bran layer. Barley, while generally considered acceptable, was far less palatable because of its toughness. Beans, widely recommended as a protein source, were often mixed with rice, but their bulky texture clashed with the tender, chewy texture of rice. The colonial authorities also promoted other minor grains, including sorghum and millet, but none of these was warmly received, only aggravating Koreans' desire for white rice.